How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Beis, Daf 52 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 52, there's a little shtickle that I intended to get to yesterday, but totally slipped my mind. So we're going to just wrap up a little bit from Nafla Min Hagag, and then we are going to get to the sugya of Nishtabru Rov Tzla Osel, what happens when most of the ribs of an animal have been broken, that treifa. And we are going to discuss different scenarios where ribs are missing, ribs are broken, things like that. That is what we have on the agenda for today. Let us jump in and learn Daf Nun Beis, Daf 52, Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Nun Beis, Amid Aleph, about 10 or so lines into the Amid. The first word on the line is dibuk. Dibuk seems to be some kind of bird trap of sorts, some kind of gluey bird trap, kind of like those mouse traps where the mouse gets glued to the thing. That's a rough one. I once had to deal with the mouse trap. That was like a classic one, the one where it like steps on the thing and the thing snaps its neck. Yeah, mouse traps. Yuck. Akuponim. So yeah, this seems to be some kind of a gluey bird trap. So you have some kind of like board or something with glue on it, and the bird gets stuck on the glue. So Rav Ashi Shari, a maimer osir. Okay, so if you have this bird, okay, so what happens is the bird lands on this gluey trap thing, and he says, I'm all gluey, and he starts flying away, and he gets weighed down and falls on the ground, and the shaila is this bird a treifa? So again, so Rav Ashi says that the bird is kosher. A maimer osir, a maimer says the bird is treif. If it is only stuck to the glue trap with one wing, and it has a free wing, so everyone agrees that the bird will be kosher, will not be a treifa, because it could mitigate the fall with the free wing. But where their machlokes is when it is doubly stuck to the glue trap, when both wings are stuck to the glue trap. So the one who says osir, he says, it's completely stuck by both wings to the glue trap. How's it going to break its fall? It's going to get really severely hurt. That's going to be risuk ivar. Uman deshari amalach efshu denekum ha'ikve degape. I don't really know what this means. Something about like the tips of its wings could somehow be able to mitigate the fall somehow, and therefore it won't be a treifa. Those who say betray gape kulam lepligi de osir, to those who say, look, if it gets stuck by both wings, everyone agrees that it's going to fall and hit hard and be a treifa. Kiplige, where they argue, is bechad gapa, when the bird is stuck by just one wing. Mandashari omerloch efsher de parach bechad gapa. So the one who permits it says, it's still got this free wing that would be able to do some flying with and mitigate the fall. The one who says osir kevin de bahai lo matzi parach bahinami lo matzi parach will say, once one wing has already been disabled, the other one is also ineffective, and the bird will fall too hardly and become a treifa. Vilchsa daloch is betray gape osir. If it is stuck by both wings, osir. Bechad gapa shari. If it's only stuck by one wing, it's permitted. And now we get up to the next section of the Mishnah, the next treifa listed in the Mishnah, Nishtabu Rov Tzla Osel, that if most of the ribs have been broken, the animal is a treifa. Tana Rabbanan the rabbis taught, Eluein Rov Tzlos. These are the majority of the ribs. Sheish mikan v'sheish mikan. Either 6 on this side and 6 on the other side, or achas esr mikan v'achas mikan, or even 11 on this side and 1 on that side. Amar Zeiri says, Zeiri umechzayon klape shedra, umechetzion klape shedra, and it has to be on the upper part of the ribs, especially if you have a cow. I mean, I imagine it's the same thing for sheep and goats, but like cows particularly have really long ribs. So we're not talking about the lower part of the ribs. We're talking about the upper half of the ribs. And we are talking about the big ribs, the big bones that have a lot of marrow in them. So there's like a lot of vertebrae on an animal. Let's just talk about a cow for now. So there's like a lot of vertebrae. Now, of all those vertebrae, and it's going to be relevant later on as well, I mean, it goes all the way from like the head all the way through the tail, right? So some of those vertebrae are going to have ribs attached to them. Others won't have ribs attached to them. Now, of the vertebrae that have ribs attached to them, 13 have ribs attached to them. However, only of those 13, and we're talking about 13 vertebrae, and each vertebra, I think, is the singular. Now, there are 13 of these vertebra that have ribs attached to them. Now, each vertebra has 2 ribs attached, so we're talking about 13 times 2 is 26 ribs. Now, of those 13 vertebra and of those 26 ribs, only 22 of them, so 11 of those vertebra, 22 of those ribs are considered the ones that have like the most marrow in them, a significant amount of marrow in them. And those are the ones that we're focused on, okay? So we're focused really on 11 vertebra and 22 ribs. And we're saying that a majority of those need to be broken, okay? So if you have 11, so the majority, right? So if you have basically 11 ribs on each side, so, if you have 22 ribs, so half would be 11, more than half would be 12. So once you have 12 broken ribs, and we're saying specifically broken on the upper half of the ribs, once you have 12 ribs broken in their upper half, the animal is a treifa. I'm going to read that again. These are the majority of the ribs. Sheish mikan v'sheish mikan. So this could be either whether it's 6 ribs on one side and another 6 ribs on the other side, or achas esrei mikan ba'achas mikan, or all 11 on one side and then 1 rib on the other side. Either one of those combinations work as long as you have 12, which is a majority of the ribs, broken. So then the animal is a treife. Omar Zeiri says, Zeiru michetzin klape shedra. We're talking about the upper half of the ribs, right by the spine. Omar Rab Babar Chana, Omar Rab Yechanan uvitzlos gedolos sheish ben moyach. The larger, bigger ribs that have more meaningful amounts of marrow. I'm going to chop a shluck of coffee and we'll go weiter. Okay. Now, Omar Ula says Ula. Ben Zakkai Omar says Ben Zakkai. Ne'ekru birov tzad echod. So if we're talking about ne'ekru, right, up until now we've been talking about broken ribs. If instead of talking about broken ribs, we're talking about ribs that have been disconnected from the vertebra. So basically, as we mentioned earlier, so we're talking about 11 of these vertebra. Well, I guess plural is vertebrae. So 11 of these vertebrae, 11 vertebrae, I don't know. A vertebra, 11 vertebrae, I guess. So you have these 11 vertebrae. Now, each of these 11 vertebrae have 1 rib on either side of it. So basically, each of these 11 vertebrae has 2 ribs attached to them. And they kind of fit in to the bone structure between the vertebrae. So each vertebra has 2 ribs attached to it. Now, so if we're talking about ribs that got detached from their vertebrae, so they're not broken, but they are detached. So again, what do we say? Ne'ekru. So if we're talking about ribs that have gotten detached, birov tzad echad. So how many detached ribs would render an animal to be a treifa? The answer is the majority of one side. One side, we're talking about 11 ribs. The majority of 11 is 6. So 6 ribs. If 6 ribs have been detached according to Ben Zakkai, if 6 ribs have been detached, so then the animal is a treifa. Nishtabru, but if we're talking about broken ribs, like we were earlier, brov shnei tzadin, then it's the majority of both sides. Both sides is 22. Majority of 22 is 12. So we're talking about 12 broken ribs to be a treifa. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with regard to the detached ribs, bein ne'ekru, bein nishtabru, brov shnei tzadin. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan holds that just like by the broken ribs, also the detached ribs, we're talking about rov shnei tzadin, the majority of both sides, i.e. 12 ribs. Okay, so Ben Zakkai makes a distinction between detached and broken. Detached is 6, broken is 12. Rabbi Yochanan says there's no distinction. Both detached and broken are 12. Amar Rav. So now Rav introduces a new category. So far we have been discussing, although I don't know if we determined yet that he's introducing a new category. We will certainly know about that shortly. But anyways, so far we've discussed broken ribs and detached ribs. Let's see what else we can discuss. Rab says, Rab, ne'ekra tsela v'chulia ima treifa. So it says Rab, if you have a rib that has been uprooted, detached, v'chulia ima, with its vertebra, okay? We're gonna have to massage this a bit and understand exactly what's going on, but we're gonna go step by step. So right now Rav is saying nekra tsela v'chulia ima treifa. If a rib gets detached along with its vertebra, the animal is treif. Just one rib along with its vertebra, the animal is treif. Amrile Rab Kahana Rav Asi the Rab. Now Rav Kahana and Rav Asi say to Rab, Ne'ekra tsela mikan v'tsela mikan v'chulya kayemes mahu. What happens in a scenario, ask Rav Kahana and Rav Asi to Rab, what happens in a scenario where you have a vertebra and both of its ribs get detached from it, but the vertebra remains in place? What's the halacha? Amar lahu gistera ka'amrisu. And Rav says, that's a gistera. Chaver, what's a gistera? A gistera is like the French guillotine, right? When an animal gets cut in half. So says Rav, this is be'etzem, the equivalent of a gistera. You have this vertebra that both of its ribs have been detached from it, and it's ki'ilu, the animal has been cut in two at that point where the ribs on either side are missing. Rav nami gistra ka'amar. But effectively, Gemara, wait a second, but isn't Rav effectively also talking about a gistra? Right? What did Rav say? Rav said that if you have one rib that gets, right, what did he say? Nekra tsela v'chuya ima treifa. That if one rib, together with its vertebra, would get uprooted, so it's a treifa. Now, what happens when a vertebra with one of the ribs gets uprooted? What happens to the other one? Memele, it's also uprooted. So now, basically, essentially, Rav's talking about a scenario where an entire vertebra, along with both of its ribs, are out of the picture. And he says it's a treifa. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi asked him about what happens when the vertebra is intact, remains there, but both of its ribs are gone. And he says that, well, that's a gistra. Why is that significant? It's significant because a gistra is a nevela, not just a treifa, but a nevela. It's an avatuma. It's a nevela. So on the one hand, Rav seems to be talking about a gistra, and he's saying it's a treifa. Rav Asi and Rav Kahana ask him about when a rib is detached on either side, but the vertebra remains intact. He says, oh yeah, that's nevela. It's a gistra. So what's going on? So Kika'amar Rav tsela below chulya. Well, Rab is talking about one rib got detached, but the vertebra remained in place. One rib got detached, but the vertebra remained in place along with its other rib. So it was really just one rib that was detached. But that can't be because what did Rab say? Rab said, Nekra tzela v'chulya ima. He didn't say that the vertebra remains intact. He says that the vertebra is disconnected together with the rib. So tzela v'chatzi chulya. Okay, so now here we go. So now there's this new category here, which is that a rib got detached, and with the rib was detached part of the vertebra. Okay, so you have the vertebra, and on either side there is a rib attached to it, and on one side the rib got detached and took with it part of the bone of the vertebra, but the rest of the vertebra along with its other rib remained intact. So now we kind of have these three categories of rib issues. One is where the rib is broken. The other is where the rib is detached. And now we have a new category where the rib gets detached and takes with it a bit of the vertebra. And that's what Rav was saying, that if one rib gets detached and takes along with it some of the part of the vertebra, it is a treifa. Okay. Michlal Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi seila below chulya amre. Okay. Which means that, okay, Rav Asi and Rav Kahana now ask Rav, what happens when a rib on either side of a vertebra, right? Both the ribs of a vertebra get detached and the vertebra remains intact. V'amrlu gistra ka'amrisu, and he says it's a nevela, it's a gistra. It's a gistra. It's not kosher. But ve'amar ula ben Zakkai Omar nekru barov tzad echad nishtab barov shnei tzadin. But Ben Zakkai had said that if 6 of the ribs get detached, so then it is treif. So meaning Rav is saying, right? Rav Asi and Rav Kahana asked Rav, what happens essentially when you have 2 ribs that are missing, right? You have a vertebra and both of its ribs get detached. That's what they're asking Rav about. And he says it's a gistra. It's no good. But Ben Zakkai had said that when it comes to detached ribs, you can have 6 ribs that are detached. So you'll say, yeah, okay, you can have 6 ribs that are detached, that's fine, but none of them can be from the same vertebra. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi were asking 2 ribs from the same vertebra, and Rav is saying it's no good. Ben Zakkai was saying you can have up to 6 ribs detached so long as they aren't, and none of them are from the same vertebra. But Rav Asi and Rav Kahana were asking about 2 from the same vertebra, and Rav says it's no good. V'amar Reb Yechanan berov shnei stadin. Okay, but Rabbi Yochanan, however, argues with Ben Zakkai, and he says, berov shnei tzadin, i.e., when we're talking about detached ribs, we're talking about 12 detached ribs. Uvrov shnei tzadin, and when you're talking about 12 detached ribs, I efshar delo kaim achad minayu ze kineged ze. And when you're talking about 12 detached ribs, by definition, you're going to have at least one vertebra where it's missing both of its ribs, right? Meaning, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he says when it comes to detached ribs, there have to be 12 detached ribs for it to be a treifa. Now, there are 11 ribs on each side that we're talking about, right? We're talking about 11 vertebra. So, to get 12, so let's say you have all of the ribs on one side, so that would be 11 ribs on one side. The 12th is going to have to be from the other side, which means you're going to have at least one pair. You're going to have at least one vertebra where it's missing both of its ribs. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying that it only becomes treif when you have 12. And Rav is saying that it's no good even when you just have two. Right? Rabbi Yochanan is saying, right? Rabbi Yochanan is saying that, right, that you have 12 ribs that have been detached, which means that you're going to have, by definition, at least one pair that's missing both of his ribs. And still, Rabbi Yochanan is saying that's not enough. You still need to have another 10 more. You have to have 12 ribs that have been detached, not just two. So, Hasam Buchna Below Asisa, well, there it's talking, Rabbi Yochanan is talking about essentially where the ribs become detached, but the vertebra remains intact. Hachabuchna V'asisa, but Rav is talking about where the rib gets detached and also along, so we're talking about two ribs that are from the same vertebra, so one vertebra with both of its ribs detached, and when they got detached, both ribs took some of the vertebra with them. If that's the case, then they're talking about the same scenario as Rav. So Rav says if you have, right, as we concluded a few lines ago, that Rav says that if you have a rib that gets detached from a vertebra and takes with it some of the vertebra, so Rav says that it's treif. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi apparently are then asking about the same scenario when the rib becomes detached and takes with it some of the vertebra. Lo shmielu dirav. Well, they hadn't heard about. They weren't aware that Rav was talking that Rav had said that when you have one rib detached with some of the vertebra, it's a treif. But they hadn't heard that, and that's why they were asking Rav about this same scenario, effectively, of when a rib has been detached together with some of the vertebra. V'liba'u mine kidirav. Well then, if they hadn't heard about Rav, well then why were they asking about two ribs? Why not just ask about one rib, right? Rav had said if one rib is detached from a vertebra and takes with it some of the vertebra, it's a treifa. Apparently Rav Asi and Rav Kahana hadn't heard about that shita, and they come to Rav and they ask about what happens when you have a vertebra and both of its ribs get detached and take with it some of the vertebra. But if they hadn't heard about Rav's shita, and this is the first time they're asking about it, why not ask about one rib that gets detached? Why immediately ask about the kind of more specific and detailed case of a vertebra that both of its ribs are detached and take with it some of the vertebra with it? Like, why not start with the simpler case of just one rib? Well, Savre liboy mine chada de parish lan tarte. Well, they figured, we're going in, we're going to ask Rav a question. Let's ask the smartest possible question that we could get the most bang for our buck and learn the most out of the answer to that question. Diba'inon mine chada, because if we just ask the simpler question of, Rav, what is the halacha when one rib gets detached from the spine? Well, based on his answer, we'll be limited in what we can learn, because hanicha yamarlon treifa kol shekain taite. Okay, so if he says, one rib getting detached from its vertebra is treif. Okay, fine. So we'll memela also know that two getting detached is also aser. Yamarlon ksheira. But if he says that the one rib getting detached from its vertebra and taking some of the vertebra with it is kosher, akati tarti kami bailan will still not know the answer about, okay, but what about if it's not just one, but it's both ribs for that vertebra? We wouldn't know the answer to that. We'd only know about the answer in the scenario of one. So Yochi Ashtanami, but still, so what did they ask? So they said, okay, so we're going to ask about one vertebra where both of its ribs are missing, and when both ribs got detached, and when they got detached, they took some of the vertebra with them. So now that's their question. But why is that necessarily a better question? They ask from Rav about both ribs getting detached. So I understand, okay, if he says that it's kosher, kol shekin chadim. Okay, great. Then certainly, if only one of the ribs were to get detached in this manner, certainly if two is kosher, certainly one is kosher. The amalu treifa, but if he says to them, it's treif, akati chada miboyalu. But still, okay, they wouldn't know the answer. And now what happens if only one of them gets detached and takes some of the vertebrae with them? They wouldn't know the answer to that question. So why is it better for them to ask about two? I'll tell you why it's better. Savri, they figured, im kain mirtach ko rosach, that they would be able to tell based on how he answered, they'd be able to learn everything that they need to know. That basically they're going to come in, they're going to ask Rav, if you have a vertebra and both of its ribs get detached and take with them some of the vertebra, what's the halacha? So if he says that it's kosher, great. We'll learn that it's kosher. And we'll also learn that if only one gets detached, of course, it's also going to be kosher. If he simply calmly answers that it is osir, so then that means, okay, so two are osir, but one is kosher. But if he gets kind of upset and says, why are you asking me about two? Even one is osir. So then we'll also be right, meaning if one was osir already, he would kind of get upset and say, why are you asking about two? Even one is osir. So by asking about the scenario where both ribs get detached, they figured that based on Rav's answer, they'll be able to know everything that they need to know. Again, if he says it's kosher, we'll know two are kosher, and certainly if only one gets detached, it's kosher. If he calmly responds that it is osir, so we'll know that when both get detached, it's osir, but one would be kosher. And if he gets frustrated and he says, why are you asking me about two? Even one is osir, then we'll know that one is also osir. So they figured that by asking about two, they would be able to get their answer in all of the scenarios that they want to know about. So again, Savi, they figured, im kain, that if it were true that not just two were asr, but even if just one rib got detached, it would be asr. Mirtach karosach, Rav would get frustrated with us. Chada treifa tati mibaya, be that if after all one is already treif, why are you asking me about two? V'aka amrile v'lo rosach. But the Gemara asked, 1 second. The thing is that this clearly didn't work. Clearly, their scheme did not work. Why did it not work? Well, we know that Rav's shita is that, as Rav had said, if one rib gets detached and takes with it some of the vertebra, Rav had said it's treif, it's asr. And here they asked him about two vertebra, and seemingly one vertebra with two ribs, right? They asked him about both ribs, and he didn't seem to get upset. He didn't say, well, even one is asr, why ask me? He didn't do that. So here they went, they asked him about both of the ribs, and their plan was that if one was asr, he would say, why are you asking me about two? Even one's asr. He didn't say that. So their plan failed, their scheme failed. So the Gemara answers, Kevin de ka'amalu gistra ka'amrisu hainu rische. So the Gemara says, no. Their plan worked. Rav did get upset. What was Rav saying? They came in and they asked, Rav, what happens if both ribs for a vertebra get detached? And what did Rav say? Gistra, why are you asking me about nevela? Right? Gistra, French guillotine, is nevela. Now, of course, this animal isn't actually getting cut in half, but it's losing ribs on either side of a vertebra. It's ki'ilu. It's right at that point. It's as if the animal's been broken in half at that point, at that vertebra. And now gistra is nevela. What did Rav say initially at the beginning of the sugya? Rav said that if one rib gets detached and takes with it some of the vertebra, it's a treifa. Now, they came and asked him about one vertebra with the ribs on either side getting detached and taking with it some of the vertebra. And he responds that it's a gistra, which is not just a treifa, but a nevela. So essentially what Rav responded to them is he did get, kind of this frustration that they were hoping to get, to be able to learn about one rib. Essentially he was saying, why are you asking me about when both ribs get detached, which is an nevela, Ask me about when one rib gets detached, which is a treifa. Ask me about the simpler scenario first, the nevela, the scenario of the treifa, when one rib gets detached. Why are you going straight to the more serious case of two ribs, which is nevela, which is a gistra? So says the Gemara that the fact of the matter is actually their scheme did work out in the way that they were hoping it would, that if one was usher, Rav would kind of let them know about that in his response, and he did, by saying that you're asking me about both ribs, that's going to make it a gister, that's going to make it nevela, but the fact of the matter is, even just one rib would already be a treifa. Amar Rav bar Rav Shila, Amar Rav Masna, Amar Shmuel. Says Rav bar Rav Shila, in the name of Rav Masna, in the name of Shmuel, Nekrat Seila Meikara, if a rib gets disconnected, the gulgoles she nech bisa beruba, or a skull that gets crushed in its majority, but none of it's like missing, it's just crushed, but like, oh, there's no brain damage or anything like that. It's specifically the skull got broken in its majority. Uvaso achofa esrova keres berubo, or the flesh that covers the majority of the belly, right? This is a concept, it's a little bit tricky to describe, but it's come up a few times since the beginning of Elu Treifis, that if you have like the belly of the animal, let's just say like a goat or something. So like if you cut open the belly of the goat, part of that belly will be covering the keres, the stomach of the animal. Then the rest of the underside of the goat would be like covering the kidneys and the other intestines and sorts and stuff like that. So if the section of the belly that is opposite the keres, the stomach of the animal, if that gets majority of that gets torn, so it's a treifa. Treifa. So Shmuel had just said that if a rib gets detached, then the animal is treif. But we have a contradiction from a Mishnah from Masechta Oyelos that we have seen, I think, at least twice already. That if you have a mace, if you have a corpse in a oil, in a tent, in a house, so then there'll be tumas oil. Taka yesterday's pasha. That's funny. There's a discrepancy between the parshas in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. So I feel like recently I've been quoting things from the parsha, but I just realized that, right, I'm saying it's yesterday's parsha, Parshas Chukas, but the truth is in Chutz La'aretz, it's this coming week's parsha, Parshas Chukas. But Parshas Chukas talks about tumas oil. Now tumas oil is that if you have a corpse in let's say a tent, so everything in the tent becomes tummy. Now, that for a kazayis, a basar min hames, a kazayis of flesh from a corpse will be matami ba'oil. But let's say you have a corpse without any flesh on it. So one scenario is, let's say you just have the vertebrae. All you have is the spine of the, right, that's the shedra. You have the spine of the corpse, just the spine, no meat or anything like that. So that's also matami ba'oil. But what if it's missing some of the vertebrae? So that's the machlekes. We've seen it before. Machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Kama chisaron b'shedra. So how much of the spine many vertebrae from the spine must be missing for tumas oil to be voided? For there won't be tumas oil. Beis Shammai shtei chulias. 2 vertebrae must be missing. Beis Hillel omrim chulya achas. Whereas Beis Hillel says even if just one vertebra is missing, there is no tumas oil. Ve'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel v'chein the Treif. Rav Yehuda says the name of Shmuel, the same Shmuel that we're talking about, we just listed those 3 things a minute ago, says that the same applies to treifa, i.e., that an animal will be treif, according to Beis Hillel, if one of the vertebrae is missing. So we see that in order for the animal to be treif, it's not enough for the rib to be detached. The whole vertebra needs to be missing. Right? Shmuel had just said a minute ago, nekrat seila meikara, that if the rib is detached, it's a treifa. Yet we see, based on the Mishnah Masechta Oyelis, which we say v'chein the treifa, the same criteria are for treifa. It says it's treifa when the when the vertebrae gets detached, not the rib. So achat seila below chulya asam chulya below seila, says the Gemara. Those are talking about two different scenarios. The Mishnah in Oilus, which we say bechin the Treifa, is talking about when the vertebra gets detached without the ribs. We're going to ask in a second, what does that mean? And Shmuel just now was talking about when a rib gets detached, but the vertebra remains intact. Now says the Gemara, okay, I understand what you mean when you say that the rib gets detached, but the vertebra remains intact. Okay, I get it. The rib gets detached. Vertebra stays. I don't understand how you can have a scenario where the vertebra gets detached, but the rib somehow remains what? Attached? Like what does that mean? Well, b'shil hey kafle. Basically, at the end, I don't have a slide for this, but essentially, an animal, let's just say a cow, has a whole bunch of vertebrae. Now, some of those vertebrae, all those vertebrae, the spine basically goes from the head all the way through the tail. Not all of those are going to have ribs. There's a section of the spine that has ribs attached to the vertebra, but there are other vertebrae that don't have ribs towards the end, towards the legs, towards the thigh, the hips. You start having vertebrae that don't have ribs attached to them. So that's what we're talking about based on the Mishnah in Oilus, when we're saying that if one of the vertebrae are missing, it's a treifa. So it's talking about those vertebrae that don't have any ribs attached to them. If one of those vertebrae is missing, it is a treifa. And what Shmuel is saying in the recent statement that we just saw, when the rib gets detached, that's talking about when you have vertebrae that have ribs attached to them. Voshaya asks, so since we say b'chein the treifa, that the same machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel applies to treifas, so then that means that when it comes to treifas, Beis Hillel is being more stringent than Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel is saying, even if an animal is missing just one of these vertebrae, it's a treifa, whereas Beis Shammai says you need two in order for it to be a treifa. One that will still be kosher. So Amalei Ravis, the Rava responds, Ki itchil, the inyan tuma itchil, davle Beis Shammai l'chumah. Einochinami. However, when this sugya, when this topic initially came up in the Beis HaMedrash and they were discussing it, it specifically came up in the context of tumas ha'oil, and it's in that context of tumas ha'oil that Beis Shammai says the tumas ha'oil only goes away once two vertebrae are missing. Beis Hillel says tumas ha'oil goes away even after just one vertebrae, and it was in that context that the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel was raised in the Beis HaMedrash, that was recorded in the Mishnah, and in that context, Beis Hillel is the more lenient opinion, and that's why this is not taught as a scenario where Beis Hillel is more stringent, i.e. when it's a treifa, because the context in which the Mishnah was discussed in the Mishnayos was in the context of tumas ha'oil. The gugoles she nechbesa beruba, if the skull gets broken in its majority, gets crushed in its majority, by Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, Rov Gov Ha, are we talking about the majority of its height, or Rov Ekefo, or the majority, right, of its essentially width? Teku, we say it's a tie. Uvasa Achov Rov Akeres Berubo, okay, this belly that is, so the majority of the section of the belly that is opposite the keres. By Rav Ashi asks, Berov Karua or Berov Natul. Okay, are we talking about if the majority of that belly is torn, or if the majority of the belly is missing? I guess, what does missing mean? Just like a chunk of the flesh underneath the belly is just gone, I guess. So Tifshal Lemitzna, but why don't we just answer our question from our Mishnah? Our Mishnah says, Keres hapnimis shenikva, shenikra rova chitzona, that if the keres, right, our Mishnah says, in Elu Treifis, the first Mishnah in Elu Treifis that we're still discussing. Our Mishnah says that if the inner keres is punctured, or if the majority of the outer keres is torn, so it's a treifa. Kol akeres kulo zoe keres apnimi, that the keres apnimi, that if punctured is treif, is the entirety of the keres. The ezu keres achitzona, what is the outer keres? Basar achofes of a keres, exactly our scenario. The flesh that covers the majority of the keres. And we're saying dafka if it's torn, not if it's removed. To which the Gemara says, no. Don't bring me right from the Mishnah. Because Midi Utayim El Shmuel, we're asking about Shmuel. Right? Shmuel is the one who made this statement about the belly over here. And according to him, that is not referring to the Keres Achitza. Ha'omer Reb Yaakov bar Nachmani Amar Shmuel Malkum She'ein Bo Milas. Right? We had, what was it? Yesterday, 2 days ago, a whole bunch of possibilities for what the Keres Achitzon was. And Shmuel said that what the Keres Achitzon is the part of the Keres Achitzon. Well, the Keres Apnimi is defined as essentially the part of the Keres that didn't have so many of these hairs on it, and that the Keres Achitzon would be the part of the stomach that had a lot of those like hairs in the stomach, those like things that stick out to absorb stuff. So i.e. Shmuel's definition of keres achitzon is essentially the majority of the actual keres. It's not talking about the flesh that's underneath the belly. So don't try to answer me by saying, well, the Mishnah is talking about that flesh underneath the belly, not according to Shmuel. And Shmuel's the one who we're asking about. So essentially, this question remains unresolved about if Shmuel is saying that we're talking about the flesh of the belly that is torn or missing. We don't necessarily have a resolution for that question. Friends, we are going to hold it at this point. Friends, that was Daf Nun Beis, Daf 52 of Masechta Chullin. At the very beginning, we wrapped up the discussion of Nefula, of Nafla Min Agag, Nefula. We discussed a bird that got stuck to a glue trap. And ultimately, the decision there was that if it got stuck to the glue trap by both of its wings and falls to the ground, it will be a treifa. But if just one of its wings was glued, it would not be a treifa. And then we discussed the sugya of nishtabu rov tzlausel, that if most of the ribs were broken. So we said in the scenario where most of the ribs are broken, and that's specifically broken on the upper half of the ribs, closer to the spine. So in that case, we had said that we're specifically focused on the 11 vertebrae that the 11 vertebrae that have ribs on either side, so 22 ribs. So the 22 ribs that have the more significant amount of marrow in them. And we said that when it comes to broken ribs, we're talking about 12. If 12 of the ribs are broken, then it's a treifa. When it comes to detached, we saw a few different opinions. So in terms of just the rib being detached from the vertebra, we saw the opinion of Ben Zakkai, who said 6 such ribs that are detached will be a treifa. Rabbi Yochanan had said 12 detached ribs. And we saw at the end, towards the end of the daf, that Shmuel's opinion was even just one such detached rib would already be a treifa. And then we saw the interesting scenario of where a rib gets detached from the vertebra and it gets detached with some of the vertebra as well. Rav says in that case it would be a treifa. And Rav Asi and Rav Kana had asked, and what if a vertebra with both of its ribs get detached and take some of the vertebra with it? And in that case, Rav says it would be considered a gistera, which would be not just treifa, but even devela. And then we wrapped up the daf essentially with a few statements of Shmuel regarding a rib that's missing, and if the skull is crushed, and if the belly of the animal is either cut or missing. So those were a little bit unresolved. Specifically, the skull being crushed and the belly, the flesh underneath the belly. Anyways, that was Daf Mem Nun Beis, Daf 52 of Masechta Chullin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.